Good morning, guys. Uh, this morning I get to talk a bit about Daniel. So that I begin with the first question that came to my mind when I was thinking about Daniel. Well, the series of sermons we're kind of doing here have been the subject is being fully committed to God. And the first question that came to my mind, well, what does it mean to be fully committed to God? At times in my life, I've felt like when I would hear the term, I would think intense effort, a heavy responsibility that might be hard to bear. It meant doing this and doing that and doing the other things. It felt like a lot of work and pressure. I mean, in short, it felt like something very stressful. At the same time, as I was thinking these thoughts, I knew people in my life who had apparently made it, so to speak, in terms of doing all of the things to be committed to God. And even as a very young person, maybe 10 or 9 or younger, I could see, and I still remember seeing, the stress under the surface of their faces, the general sense that my friends, the children of these very committed people, were, maybe nervous to take the wrong steps with mom and dad. And all in all, my impression was that doing commitment was not a path to happiness. But I still tried it all the same, even if I did reserve some skepticism, because it seemed like the right thing to do in some extent. At college, when my friends got together to burn all of their non-Christian CDs or purge their lives of anything that wasn't the right kind of influence or had too much of a rhythm or beat, I held back. Not that I was wealthy enough to own any CDs, but even in spirit, I couldn't really commit to what at that time was touted as being fully committed. Not, I watched the passion and the excitement of my friends, and I wanted to be caught up in it, and I thought that maybe I just wasn't, fully committed to God enough, and I hoped that that would come later. You know, Years went on. Many of my friends and acquaintances who had been fully committed left the church or had dramatically different walks with God. My impression was my impression was that their commitment had led either towards bitter lives, or in a few cases they had given up their belief in God for atheism. And as I would read through their blog posts about the changes of faith, or listen to their fairly heartfelt descriptions of how they had left a God who watched over their every move and demanded they care for everything, and how now they were so happy just being themselves and helping each other. As I heard them describe their quote unquote their new values, I was really struck by something. The new beliefs they talked about, the ones that they had come to by giving up God, uh, were the beliefs that I had always thought were the beliefs of my church and my community. How was it I thought that in order to find God, my friends had to give up His very existence? Um, so this takes me to Daniel. I've heard a lot of sermons on Daniel. As a kid, there were just a few, maybe 3 or 4 kinds of sermons. One would be about Daniel, the man committed to the health message, risking death in order to obey God and not eat meat or unhealthy food. Many of the others would be related to how we can have absolute certainty in the commands of the Bible because of how trustworthy the prophecies of Daniel are. Some sermons would be about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Others might be about the 2300-day prophecy or the 70-week prophecy or the 1260-day prophecy. And all of them were very fascinating to me and still are. And all of these sermons were very popular. As kids, we liked the thinking behind them and the pictures as well. And some of the presenters were definitely focused at us. Um, and while there were some exceptions, I think that it isn't too far off to say that a lot of these sermons had as their general theme the idea that Daniel was an example of being fully committed to obeying God, and that his prophecies were evidence that we could be confident that being fully committed to obeying God was what we were supposed to be, that it was how we were supposed to live. So after these presentations, we could be a little bit more satisfied about having to listen to Dad, or about not being allowed to wade over our knees on Sabbath in the lake or something like that. Um, so, what was Daniel's story? In general, it's a story of captivity and abuse. We read in Daniel 1 from the beginning, in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So what follows is a story of Daniel and his friends making a really important decision. I think that it was often told to me, I think that while it was often told to me as a story about overcoming temptation, what I am reading in the story that immediately follows this is the story of Daniel and his three friends asking to be fed healthy food. What I feel, I am reading this story that's very similar to the story we read of Jeremiah buying a field just before Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, basically expressing his belief that God is still with his people. Or other similar stories of people continuing to hold on to hope. Daniel choosing to eat healthy food rather than the delicacies that have been dedicated to other gods with very different values. Daniel and his three friends together choose that despite what has happened to them, separation, captivity, being made into eunuchs, they are keeping their hope in God. They aren't giving up. It should, it shouldn't be surprising that this is not the only story of captivity and people making these types of decisions in the Bible. There are actually several, and they are among the best known and best loved stories. Take the story of the little servant girl and Naaman, for example. We know during the time of the northern kingdom, around the time of Elisha and Elijah, Syria, or Aram, as it's often called in the Bible, out of Damascus, essentially the kingdom centered on Damascus, was often raiding into the country, especially outside of the cities of the northern kingdom of Israel, and they would take They would take people and make them into slaves and make them into servants. And one of these people who was captured in a raid, possibly with many members of her family killed, was taken and made a slave or a servant in the house of an important military leader. And when that leader got sick, a general in the king of Syria's army, Naaman, the girl said, my God can heal you. I can't for certain say what her motivations might have been for serving God, for talking about what was good for her master. Perhaps she was hoping for a better life, or perhaps she had full confidence that God would do a miracle for her master. But I personally think that she truly cared about Naaman and his wife and was doing what she could for the people that were now around her, even though these were the same people currently in conflict with her homeland. We have the story of Joseph. Joseph, not so much captured and sold into slavery, but sold into slavery by his brothers into Egypt. First sold as a slave into the house of Potiphar, where he serves his new master and all of his household so well that he is made into administrator, because he obviously cares for all of the people around him and the prosperity of the community. How he is then betrayed because he's then sent to prison because he refuses to betray his position and his responsibilities, and how his service in prison eventually leads him into an even higher position where he is now tasked with caring for the lives of all of the people of Egypt. And we know some of his thoughts in particular. We do know that he chose to be loyal, respectful, honorable, and that his actions ended up saving not only the lives of his family, but also the lives of the people of Egypt. And remember, he did not accept this position out of a desire to save his family. He was there for the people around him. So this takes me back to Daniel. Daniel, right in chapter 1, has chosen to be faithful to God. And the next real story about Daniel is in chapter 2. And this is a kind of a test. Summary. Uh, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream which he can't remember. He then asks the wise men of Babylon, and the astrologers and the soothsayers, to tell him the dream and the meaning, and they can't. Uh, Now, Daniel asks for time now in order to talk to God and get the answer. My impression is that Daniel has not been consulted even in the initial encounter between the wise men and the king. Um, when the king got upset at them and decided that they should all be killed. However, in verse 24 of chapter 2, we read, "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation.'" So from here we know that he goes, tells the king the interpretation of his dream, and is also clear when talking to the king that this doesn't make him more wise than his erstwhile competitors, the other wise men. In verse 30 he says, "But as for me, the secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living. But for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart." Now, I think I'm getting closer to the heart of what I'm saying here. Um, is this a story about Daniel and his three friends courageously obeying God when those around them aren't? Um, Not really. There's no obedience going on here at all that I can tell. I mean, well, there is, but not in the way that I often thought of it as a kid when I listened to the stories of Daniel or the songs of Daniel or the ones we sang earlier, Dare to be a Daniel. It's not so much obedience of the Ten Commandments or the Levitical laws, it's the other one. Um, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Towards the end of Matthew 5, in the text from the Sermon on the Mount, we read in verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors who you despise do so? Therefore, you shall be perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect." Now, when I look at Daniel, I don't think he had a lot of time given to him in his position as a wise man eunuch in the service of the king of Babylon to pursue extracurricular church activities. I know he was able to pray, but for all I know, he never had time to attend synagogue or fellowship with other believers outside of his three co-workers. He may have never even been able to give a talk, and he certainly wasn't able to raise a group of children in the correct way. And it's likely he wasn't given much leeway or even opportunity for breaking a lot of the other commandments. Um, what he did have an opportunity for was to hate those who had taken everything from him. He was given the opportunity to watch them fall and die, and he didn't take it. Instead, he saved the lives of those who wished him ill will and spent his life faithfully serving the man who had taken him into captivity, using the wisdom God had given him to help him care for the people of the Babylonian Empire. Very often, commitment to God has been sold to me not so much as commitment to God's character, but as commitment to obeying God. Commitment has been fed to me as a justification for adding stress to my life. It has meant accepting new responsibilities that I can feel insecure about, or new activities to fail at. It has meant not so much impossible standards, but at least it has meant caring about my standards and the standards placed on me more than just caring about the people that have ended up in my life. For me, I think that in Daniel, we see a person who, yes, did commit to following God, but more importantly, he committed to following the most important commandment, loving every person that God has created. Loving every child of God for who they were. In 1 Corinthians 10:24, we can read, "Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being." And when we really take this to heart, it does let us do what I think Joseph and Daniel and the servant girl did, acting for others, for the world around us. Um, let's see. Oh, I just skipped off to a different spot. All right, we have standards for ourselves for reasons. Um, at times it can seem that those reasons are to show who is in and who is out of our circle. I'm sure we've all heard good talks about how that is not a healthy way of looking at standards or identity. We know that holding standards for reasons of showing who is with God or not ends up hurting people. I mean, at other times, we hold up standards as a list of things that we do to be right with God. And this too seems to always end up in twisting what God wants for us. We end up doing good things for our neighbor out of our sense of duty to God rather than just because we feel like helping our neighbor. All these things can make life more complicated, more stressful. And when things really start to get difficult, i.e., when there's a lot of things going on in the world and people need help, uh, to spend most of our time helping others, it can lead to us spending most of our time helping others and what's left of it worrying about whether we are doing enough. This is probably enough to push most of us around the bend. But we know that this is not what God wanted for us. Only taken slightly out of context, we know that Jesus stated that some of the law was written so clearly and in such detail because of the hardness of our hearts, and that we just needed the example set out for us in order to figure out what love was. But we know that God's hope is that through his example, through Jesus' example, we can actually get to where we are able, let's see, we can actually, oh yeah, through Jesus' example, we uh, we know that God's hope is that through his example, through Jesus' example, we can actually get to where we are able to just live our lives with joy, loving those around us, caring for those in whom we see hurt, not out of an obligation to him, to ourselves, to our community, but just out of care. Let's read the section from Matthew 5 again. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the just, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Um, you know, Going through Revelation or through the prophets that we've been looking at recently, we see many situations where wickedness or just evil in general is sort of symbolized by spiritual Egypt, or where the power of the beast of Revelation is represented or called Babylon, or Babylon the Great. Yet we have the stories of Joseph and Daniel living in those respective countries, loving the people there and saving them just as a matter of course, without thought. Likewise in both Daniel and Revelation, we see reference to Rome as being a great symbol of evil and misuse of power. Yet in Matthew 5, just following the section we read, we have a section where we're told to, if someone forces you to carry their pack 1 mile, carry it 2. In other words, the people who had this power would have been Roman soldiers. So all of these people who are parts of movements or under these organizations that are depicted as being against God's people are in God's eyes his children, his people. Yet Daniel, Joseph, and Jesus genuinely and simply cared for them, not out of obligation, not often even against the standards of their time, just choosing to help the oxen in the ditch when they encountered it, or healing the man on the Sabbath because that was when it was needed. I really want to kind of bring what I'm saying to a conclusion now. So here it is. When it comes to living our lives, we can keep it simple. You know, to quote a movie, let's just be excellent to each other, remembering that everyone we meet is a part of our family and God's family. As we help each other, we don't have to think about why we're helping. We just do it because we choose to care. As we make healthy choices and do listen to the things that God has asked of us, we know that he's doing it because, A, giving us that good advice is part of how God cares for us himself, And B, we know that making good choices lets us be better able to express our care for others and those that we are able to choose to love. And in those times when we feel like just a little bit of celebrating the fall of the unrighteous or taking a little amount of pleasure in the misfortune of those who obviously had it coming, um, you know, we can remind ourselves that they're God's children as well, and that like Daniel, we want to learn to love them so we can be happy in their joy as well. Um, there's a verse in Proverbs 24:17. It says, "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls. Do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles." And I think that's roughly what I want to say. We do the things we do for their own sake, and that is the joy that God wants for us. And that's what I see Daniel doing.
Thank you, Dale.